Hi YouTube, Darth here. This is Battle Plan, a video series where I talk about the big picture strategies you can use to help you achieve victory on Battlefield maps. Today's target is Operation Locker, one of the vanilla maps for Battlefield 4. This is definitely one of the most played maps in Battlefield 4 and definitely one of the maps that everybody seems to get wrong. Today I'm going to talk about the tips and strategies I use to help win games of Operation Lockers and what you can do to at least help move along deadlocked games. The layout for Operation Lockers is probably one of the simplest in Battlefield. On Conquest Large there are 5 points: Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, and Echo. Between them there are really only 2 major lanes with some minor connections in between. Conquest Small is similar but with only 3 points, Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, and the team spawns are moved up to where the other 2 flags are on Conquest Large. Even though the general layout of the map doesn't change much between the different versions, the dynamic of the map changes quite a bit with the number of players. I can guarantee you that 64 players on this map plays quite a bit differently than 32 or less. So let's dissect the map somewhat. There are 2 primary routes or lanes in the map, the interior and the exterior. Because of this, on servers with large numbers of players, there tend to be natural points where players jam up at the center and just before the Russian and US spawns. On 64-player Operation Locker, unless you're a superstar, you're not going to be clearing the jams directly. Instead, it should be your goal to bypass the enemy's strong point entirely. This usually requires a bit of intuition about where the enemy team is, and on this map, most players tend to stick to the interior lane. There are other, more numerous smaller routes that can be run, but for the most part, players choose one route or the other. For starters, let's talk about the center of the map, Charlie on Conquest Large. This point is highly contested in each and every round, but this point is also a spoiler. Far too many players spend the entire round trying to take this point at the expense of the rest of the map. It's a great asset to have, and its possession usually is indicative of which team is winning. But Charlie is very easy to undermine under the right circumstances. Let's look at a common situation. In this case, the Russian team is in control of Echo, Delta, and Charlie. 9 times out of 10, there will be a huge stack of infantry on both the upper and lower levels of Charlie waiting to intercept any and all attackers. This is reciprocated on the opposite side by the US team. In essence, it's a stalemate, a reenactment of World War I where the first man to poke his head above the trench lines gets it shot off. The obvious play in this situation is to go outside. Generally, the outside is lightly populated, and even when it's not, it can be pretty easily cleared by a squad cooperating with each other to push. Now, trying to take Charlie from the outside is going to result in failure, as if there are not already 1 or more defenders in the stairs looking outside, the stairs get flooded pretty quickly once the alarm goes up. I see far too many opportunities get squandered when players stop and try to assault Charlie directly from the outside. Unless the enemy team is pushed all the way to Bravo, you're going to be running into what is likely to be 9/10 of their team. Instead of trying to clear the immediate problem, go deep. Get yourself all the way to Echo. Keep in mind, those enemies that you see along the way are going to call you out. Enemies you kill will be respawning and telling their buddies about you. The further you can make it undetected, the more likely you're going to be to capture a point. If you try to grab Delta, it's a much easier trip for the bulk of enemy forces to recapture this point. Additionally, beware that if you try to flank Charlie by going through Delta, you're going to trip the alarm for any watchful enemies as you go through Delta's capture perimeter and make the flag flash briefly. Now, both Echo and Alpha are hard to hold on to once you've captured them, but Echo is quite a bit easier to hold than Alpha. This is because the upper level on Echo can more easily control the point. The purpose of this flanking maneuver is not necessarily to directly win the game, you just have to hold the point long enough to be a nuisance. Nuisance is enough to draw off defenders at Charlie. Remember, if almost all of both teams are playing the middle route, this is where defenders will have to be drawn off to counter your flank. The more they have to backcap, the easier it is for that dam to break and your team to pour through. Also, your team will likely begin spawning on this point and threatening the enemy team with a serious back rage. If the enemy team doesn't respond strongly to this attack, you should definitely press the attack into Delta and even Charlie if you can. If you're playing on the Russian team, this strategy also works in reverse on Alpha and Bravo. Just remember that in any situation where you control one route and the enemy is stronger in the other, the further you go past the bulk of their forces, the easier it is to capture more ground before meeting stiff resistance. So what happens if both teams are reinforced heavily in both routes? It can quickly become a stalemate, but the enemy can't be strong everywhere. You should be looking for the weak points to force a breakthrough. 9 out of 10 times I've found that to be the outside in the snow, but there are occasions where another weak point has presented itself. Let's take a closer look at the finer points of Operation Lockers, as each flag has their individual strengths and weaknesses. At Alpha, there is easy access from the outside of the map, however it is usually difficult to see if there are any defenders inside the point looking outside. If I suspect enemies may be lurking, I prefer a slightly less direct route using the nearby ladder to go into the basement and then up and around to either the first or second floors. While capturing Alpha, there are a number of possible waiting locations from which to choose. I found that the best spot is behind the concrete in this corner. Your weakest are defenders coming from upstairs, but you're extremely well protected from everything else. The other points are serviceable, but because there are 4 to 5 entry locations into Alpha, it's hard to cover them all unless your back is to a wall. Keep in mind that you're close to the US spawn, so Alpha can be retaken relatively quickly if you press on to Bravo. The story of Bravo is not much better. While there are a great number of ways to approach the point, there really aren't a lot of options for capturing this point. You have to be in the center of the mess hall area to capture it. Defender spawns can come from outside, inside, and the other 2 adjacent points. That's why it's better to grab Alpha if you're flanking as a lone Russian, and if you can, try capturing this point with a squad to cover more angles. Once captured, the kitchen area presents some interesting options for defense, as you can get in some excellent cover against both reinforcements from Charlie and Alpha. However, it's definitely not good if you're on the wrong side of where enemies are entering. Let's skip to the other side of the map and talk about Echo. This is probably one of the easiest points to defend with a squad of players. It can be hard to approach from the outside because the snow and light obscures the inside. This makes attacking the point from the outside harder if the enemy knows you're coming. The point can be captured from anywhere inside the room, above or below. The walls below are destructible, but generally the upstairs is where you want to be if you're capturing the point, as you'll be able to defend against reinforcements much more readily, as you'll have the high ground and the initiative against anybody below. And even though it's very defensible, it's still relatively easy to take by yourself, assuming that not many reinforcements show up. Delta is one of the easier points on the map to capture, as you can hide in a number of locations while capturing a point. If I'm flanking from Echo, I generally try to take up a position in the basement of Delta that gives me an eye on the routes from Charlie. Otherwise, taking up position anywhere in the cells is also quite viable, especially if you're waiting for squad spawns. Generally, the staircases at Delta are dangerous to stay around if you're capturing the point, but they're great strong points once the point is captured and the enemy has been cleared. This is especially true if your team is pressed up with you. Now I'm going to talk about Charlie. It's obviously the heart of the map, and it's the point that everybody strives to capture. However, it's the point which is the least important to focus on, as it's the pivot point of the map, but not where you should be pushing if you want to topple the enemy team. With that out of the way, let's look at the details. It's exceptionally difficult to get into Charlie when the enemy team is stacked up inside. You can try smoke, flashbang grenades, and any other number of ways to enter the strong points or the stairs, and you might even kill a few enemies, but respawns and secondary lines of defenses will almost always stop lone assaults. Unless you're in a squad and coordinating, the cowardly soldiers who usually hang out at these strong points will almost never follow you in or be aware enough to even know what happened. I've had more luck below than with above, but I want to emphasize again that pushing on Charlie directly is pretty well impossible if the enemy team is defending it in numbers. Or, has a pulse. If the tower is up, you should definitely consider assaulting from below. Especially at the start of the round, this can give you control of the staircase, which may be critical in removing enemies from inside the tower. If you can rush and take control of the tower first, it can certainly win you the point for the beginning of the round. However, be very aware of what the state of the basement below is for the reasons I just mentioned. If the tower is down, Charlie becomes easier to access for both teams, but not necessarily easier to defend or attack. Attackers from below can get into capture position quicker, but so can't responding and respawning defenders. Additionally, it becomes possible to attack through the floor grates, so that's a definite advantage for respawning attackers above. Charlie is a tough nut to crack and pretty much impossible to take if the enemy team is in position to defend it, so be sure to consider other options first, like going outside. If you're going outside, a lot of the recommendations I'll make are class dependent, and I'll talk more about some specific recommendations in the loadout section of this video. Otherwise, my general tip would be to try to be aware of which team is in control of the outside, as it will affect where you'll want to spawn pretty heavily. For example, if you don't see your team outside, assume the enemy is in control of it, possibly with soldiers all the way to your backmost capture point. You'll probably want to spawn further back and then work your way forward. Definitely keep an eye on your back flags and call it out if they start blinking. Otherwise, your goal should be to try and push as far as you can up the outside route. Definitely keep an eye on the minimap for the M82 rifle battle pickup at Charlie, as it can provide a wonderful tool to help you clear the lane for your team. Additionally, at the start of the round, keep an eye on the pickup icon, as if it disappears, you'll know the enemy team beat you there and that you have to be very careful to not get one shot by the M82. One last trick you can use to get yourself around enemies on the outside is to go out of bounds on the snow. There are a number of places that you can do this and still return to the playable area of the game. My favorite places to do this tend to be around Alpha, at Charlie, and near the helipad at Delta. Now keep in mind that there are servers out there that will kick you for going out of bounds, so you'll want to be aware of the server rules. However, pretty much anybody that uses the mountain exploit is a tool bag and deserves to get shot. Don't be that guy. On Operation Locker, you're going to want to be one of 3 classes, either Recon, Assault, or Support. You can try being an engineer if you like, but their strengths really don't come into play unless you're trying to get a kill or two with the rocket launchers. If you're flanking outside pretty consistently, then I would recommend either playing as a Recon or as a Support. Aggressive recon is how I love to run my recon class on this map. Generally I will pick up a silenced carbine, a tugs, and a radio beacon to spawn my squad. This is a pretty effective setup for getting in and capturing the enemy's rear flags. Especially if you're at Echo or Alpha, that tugs can help you lock it down from returning enemies. If you lose the point, the radio beacon can provide an easy way for your squad to return back to it. The carbine and tugs combination makes you a vicious surprise assassin of enemies. There are great places for a radio beacon on Operation Lockers if your team is having a hard time pressing on the outside. My personal favorite is a spot just under the exit from the kitchen at Bravo. This place is particularly advantageous for the Russian team as you can put a beacon down here and climb up the nearby hills to get to Alpha. It's especially rare that enemies look down here without knowledge from a commander's UAV. But there are tons of places like this on the outside lane, especially next to the ledge, so be sure to look for great spots to hide your radio beacon. As support, I generally pick either the MG4 or my personal favorite, the M240 Bravo. For gadgets, I usually run with an ammo bag and either a UCAV or C4. The UCAV is particularly effective outside when you have a lot of enemies to overcome or a particularly pesky sniper. It's a great way to scout early in the game to see the enemy disposition outside. Keep in mind though that you'll need to stick close to the pathway because the ceiling is very low on this map and your UCAV can easily get stuck there. As for C4, it's a great tool for tossing around crowded corners or dropping it on enemies who are not aware that you're above them. Since there tend to be large clusters of enemies on this map, it can be a great tool to clear huge numbers of the enemy. A silenced LMG is perfect for flanking large groups of enemies, which happens pretty regularly on lockers if you're securing the outside and then turning inside. I also find that because so many enemies tend to run in clusters and charge without thought, that having 100 or 200 bullets at the ready is absolutely necessary. As for assault, I think this class is best for players who run with the squad or are fighting mostly on the inside of the map. The medkits and bags are absolutely necessary to maintain yourself during the considerably lengthy firefights that happen inside. As for a choice of weapon, I'd pick the high damage per second weapons with good ammo reserves. The AEK-971 is probably my favorite choice for the inside, while the M416 would probably work better for a player that is also going to go outside. The Bulldog and the FAMAS have better damage, but their low ammo counts can leave you in serious trouble if you find yourself in sustained combat, and they're handicapped when it comes to ranged combat outside. Whatever loadout you're using, I'd highly suggest using a suppressor if you plan on spending any amount of time indoors. It's a lot of close quarters fighting and people are frequently making note of their minimaps. Overall, Operation Lockers is a difficult map to get progress on if your team can't capitalize on short-term gains. Generally, the map chokes up at very specific points and it's really up to you and your squad to make opportunities happen for your team. If you can get those openings, it very often can lead to serious swings in your team's favor, and that's the game. Or at least, that's the plan. That's it for this episode of Battle Plan. If you liked this episode, please leave a like before you go. If you're new around here, check out my channel and please consider subscribing. If you've got a map and a game mode you'd like to see me discuss in a future episode, please leave a comment below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, YouTube.